Today I'm going to talk about Lumumba, this historical figure who has become larger than life in a way. I'm sure you all have a Lumumba living somewhere in your head, and I want to address this process of characterization that is based upon a selection of historical facts by analyzing some narratives. I will focus mostly on literary narratives. In the title it said I would focus also on Congolese literature, but I will mostly focus now on Belgian literature from the diaspora writers and from white Belgian writers, because I think that's the thing I can say about most today. Before I begin, I want to address first my position and my perspective, because this topic is related to decolonization and to racism matters, and then it may be good to think about the position you're speaking from. I come from the field of Dutch and Flemish literary studies in Belgium, which is, if I have thought about it well, 100% white. That's very typical for Belgium. The black community, or the people of color community in Belgium, especially the black community, is very small. Migration from the Congo, in 2006 only 40,000 people, Congolese migrants, lived in Belgium. So there's very few Congolese people. The African community is bigger, but it hasn't come, they haven't been active in the field of Dutch and Flemish literary studies. There has been some reflection going on in our field, because the reason is for that lies with us, partly, and we want to change something about that. Part of it is doing more research about literature, about the colonial period, about the post-colonial period, and also changing the way we teach about that kind of literature. That was a necessary disclaimer, I think. Now I will start. This is the structure of my presentation. I will start with introducing you, by telling you a bit about the discussions that have been going on recently on decolonization in Belgium. Then I will shortly tell you a bit about the historical figure Lumumba, to get that back on the top of your mind. And then I will analyze some representations of Lumumba in narrative art, in literary narratives and in other narratives. So, the discussion on decolonization in Belgium has, like everywhere, anti-colonialist views have existed in Belgium since the beginning of colonialism, marginally of course, but they have always been there. The most visible contributors to this debate were mostly white academics, writers, journalists, and activists. Because of the turmoil in Congo, Congolese academics haven't been able to contribute a lot, or have been heard a lot in this. And then academia and other fields in Belgian culture haven't been very diverse either, so that's why mostly white male people have talked about this topic. But recently that has changed. The African community has become more vocal, because the second generation has started reflecting on decolonization matters. There has been a lot of influence from the US, from Black Lives Matter movements, decolonization discussions, and so on. I have here included two pictures of two activist groups, Back Space Back, who organizes lots of evenings in which decolonization is discussed. The second one is the Collectif Mémorial pour la décolonisation et la lutte contre les discriminations. They talk about statues in the public space. And the last one is an issue of a well-known cultural magazine that was focused entirely on decolonization, so that was quite a thing. Recent events included the inauguration of Lumumba Square. Activists have been wanting to have this Lumumba Square in Brussels for a long time. Last year it really happened. Lumumba Square is close to the Royal Palace in Brussels, where there's a famous statue of Leopold II. There has been a lot of activism directed against these statues as well. They have been painted red because, of course, Leopold has blood on his hands. So yeah, if it concerns Congo. So people have pointed that out and wanted them to be removed or framed. This is a famous statue in Ostende. Leopold II is high up there on his horse, and he's veneered by, is that a word? Hailed by, among others, Congolese people, but an activist has cut off the hand of this Congolese figure to show like the cruelty of the regime of Leopold. I don't know if you know this story, but Congo was a private enterprise, and he didn't have a real army, only like a private militia. They didn't have a lot of bullets, and for each bullet they used, they have to hand in a hand of someone to show that they used it for something. So of course this symbolizes the cruelty of his regime. The Belgian government took Congo over as like a national colony, but they hailed Leopold II as a genius and as a civilizer after 1908. So they didn't take over the criticism that was directed against him, that came from US and mostly UK investigators. Another thing that has been important was the reopening of the Royal Museum for Central Africa. This is also an interesting case because the building of that museum was built by Leopold II, or he commanded it. It looks a bit like the Royal Palace. It was built as a propaganda place in the World Exhibition in Brussels. So within the building, it is protected. There are all these fragments that still glorify Leopold II. So his emblem is above the entrance, or what used to be the entrance. There's this other emblem saying like civilization happened in the Congo because of the Belgians. The new museum directors cannot remove these things, so they have tried to compensate it. But apparently the UN has sent a commission to Belgium to evaluate the decolonization efforts, and they have said, like, for instance, the museum isn't enough, or it's not they haven't gone as far as one would expect in this current moment. This is, I hope I can show this. This is another thing that spurred discussion. There was a satiric play about Leopold II that was written in 1970, but that was restaged 1 year ago, and it included blackface, and I hope I can show this, and if so then I will skip it. But it included blackface. They didn't really reflect on what satire does with when you represent colonial past. So it was very heavily criticized for that. And it like spurred debate in the national newspaper and so on and so on. That happened last year. This also happened last year. The national Flemish television showed a series reflecting on Belgium's colonial past. And for the first time, they let people from the African community, from the Congolese community, and Congolese people tell their stories about that, like directly in the camera. And that hasn't ever happened before. So things are changing slowly and with trial and error. It's interesting to see what will happen in the coming years. We can discuss this decolonization process by focusing on Lumumba and how he has been represented in the narratives that surround us in Belgium. And to give you an overview of his life, Lumumba was born in 1925. For most of his life, he worked as an employee at the post office and as a beer salesman. He practiced his rhetorical skills by doing that. He also read a lot because he had access to libraries. He read a lot of French philosophy. He also was an évolué. I don't know if you're acquainted with that concept. The Belgian colonial powers, they wanted to create some kind of an elite, évolués, and they made them dress like white people lived, and make them live in, or allowed them to live in houses that looked very Western. So that's of course a very racist way of creating an elite, or like installing hierarchies. But because of this, because he belonged to this évolué group, he had also access to education. And by that he slowly developed Pan-African and anti-colonial ideas. He also traveled to Ghana, participated in a conference, and developed those ideas more and more. He became, at the end of the 1950s, he became the leader of the Mouvement National Congolais. In comparison to other political leaders, it was remarkable that he was a nationalist. Other leaders represented their ethnic background, like for instance Kasavubu, who became the first president of the Congo. He represented the Congo. But Lumumba wanted to unite the country. He thought that was important. He won the elections. He was the first democratically elected prime minister. He didn't become president because too many people had a problem with that, but he became the first prime minister. And he remained in office only for 2 months because, as you all know, he was assassinated. What happened after the independence of Congo? He gave a speech. For 4 days there were peaceful parties everywhere, but Belgium was already installing a neo-colonial system. There was also mutiny in the army because there were only white officers, and that became a problem, of course, after independence. So there were big problems in the army. And then the Katanga, that's the province which was really rich in minerals, which had all the diamonds, the copper, the zinc. They successed, so they wanted to be independent from the rest of Congo. So that, of course, was also a big problem for the first prime minister of this big country. Lumumba went to the United Nations and to the US. He asked for help, but didn't get it. They wouldn't send him like military help. And after that, because he didn't get help, he turned to the USSR, and this worried a lot of actors on the global level and put into work Cold War politics. So that's like it was a whole series of events with different responsibilities, which made that Lumumba was dismissed and imprisoned and eventually killed on January 17. It happened with support from the Belgian government. It was Belgian people who also did it. Moïse Tshombe, who was the leader of the Katanga province, was present. The CIA knew about it, and the Katanga government also knew about it. So it was this whole complex of different actors who enabled the assassination. The names of the killers are still officially unknown. They haven't been put to trial, so that's still a thing that's up in the air. But immediately after his death, Lumumba, he became an icon of the fight against colonialism and racism all over the world, also of Pan-Africanism. He has been named as a fighter for freedom by big names. I mean, Nkrumah, Che Guevara, Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon. They have like hailed him as a freedom fighter. But there's still, like in general, no global consensus about his political legacy. Different groups use Lumumba to affirm their own views of Congo and what happened. In Belgium especially, people have been investigating his murder, especially Lieselot De Taeye. He published documents that prove that the Belgian state had a direct responsibility, and that led the Belgian government to install this, or the parliament to organize this research commission, or ask for this research commission, and their conclusion was that Belgium was morally responsible for Lumumba's murder, so in an indirect way responsible. Louis Michel, who used to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he apologized for that. 8 years later, he also still glorified the genius of Leopold II. But this is something important that happens and that spurred some debate. And well, all those things I told you before about the decolonization process also are an ongoing thing about Belgium coping with its colonial past. In Congo, Lumumba, there was a statue was erected for Lumumba in Kinshasa in not in 1966. He was rehabilitated by Mobutu in 1966, and the Kabila regime, Kabila Senior, erected this statue. And in other countries, he's on the bill of 10 cities in Guinea. There are streets. There are a lot. He appears often in street arts. So Lumumba has become an icon, and we can see that in the representations of him as a historical figure in narrative arts. I will cite some Belgian scholars and their views on this. So Matthias de Groof has said it is no coincidence that he has merged into an imaginary afterlife in the arts. After all, his project remained unfinished and his corpse unburied. I haven't told you, but his corpse was cut into pieces and then dissolved in acid. Different arts observe the memory and the undigested suffering that inscribed itself upon Lumumba's body and upon the history of the Congo. De Groof has also distinguished between 3 different Lumumbas. There's the historical figure, you could say, who connects the colonial Congo with the independent Congo, where like neo-colonial tendencies already manifested itself. He's also a metaphor for what happened to the Congo in the last 50 years, so after his death. And for some communities and groups, he's also a metaphor for what happens to the global south, so the discrimination that's happening. So that's 3 different Lumumbas already. He has appeared in Congolese literature, for instance in this book by Sonny Labutansi. He really plays with this difference between the living Lumumba and the dead Lumumba. There's a real ambiguity going on in his book, and it's really interesting to see that the living Lumumba is maybe even less important than the dead Lumumba and what he meant. In Leopolis also, this assassination of this freedom fighter is also foregrounded. These works are more internationally known. Aimé Césaire's Une saison au Congo is a theater play about the life of Lumumba. Césaire depicts Lumumba as a bit of an arrogant politician, but still he says this arrogance shows more than anything else how much of a martyr he is. He arises like as a Christ-like figure from this play, as a martyr. The second one is a movie by Raoul Peck, who also made the movie about James Baldwin, I'm Not Your Negro. Also, this is like a depiction of the life of Lumumba, but at the beginning of the movie, Lumumba speaks from beyond the grave. So again, there's this tension between the living and the dead Lumumba, and the importance of those two Lumumbas. The last one is The Poisonwood Bible, a best-selling novel here in the US, written by Barbara Kingsolver. In that book, Lumumba is more like a politician. In the movie by Peck, also his private life is shown Lumumba as like a father and a husband, but Kingsolver really shows him as like an activist and a political figure. So there are some narrative tensions in all these books, foregrounded in all these books. I talked to you a bit about them all. So a leader who's responsible for everything he does versus a victim of international political powers. Some people have framed, especially Western media in the 1960s, have framed Lumumba as a rioter, and like Césaire's play was a reaction against that, and he framed him not as a rioter but as a martyr, by writing this counter-narrative. And yeah, there's also the tension between the undiplomatic politician versus the prophet, who addressed the truth, political life, private life, living and dead. If we look at the Belgian, or at the Flemish examples right now, another image arises. The first one I'm going to talk about is David van Reybrouck. He wrote this best-selling non-fictional history book about Congo in 2010, like celebrating 50 years of Congolese independence. And the image he shapes of Lumumba is different than the ones we have seen. He actually paints a very negative portrait, and does that in different ways. So here, I'll first read the example. He says, at one moment there were sports contests at State Baudouin. Kasavubu was supposed to hand the trophy to the winners, but Lumumba grabbed it away from him and did it himself. So he's portrayed as like this really ambitious, selfish politician. In an implicit way, this is a classic show don't tell going on. There's also more, it's in an implicit way, this is more, the next example is more explicit characterization. So here the narrator is speaking, or Van Reybrouck is speaking, saying that he was too focused on attaining immortality, too blinded by the romanticism of Pan-Africanism. He who was, after all, the great advocate of unity in Congo, forgot that on his first day of autonomy he shouldn't be leading his country to reconciliation rather than divisiveness. So here the narrator is speaking. He also, the book is based on interviews, so he also lets Congolese people paint the same image. Saying it would be a mistake to assume that all of Congo rejoiced at its Prime Minister's daring words. Bolonga, so that's one of his interviewees, in any case found it troubling. Lumumba was no diplomat, he was far too categorical. Continuing, for many Bakongo, Lumumba was no hero. All people in Bakongo say even today, Lumumba was empty-headed, affected and rude. He was a source of our problems. The way he talked to the king, that was irresponsible. He should have said, you people are independent now, so come on, get to it.
The king being Baudouin?
Baudouin, yeah, during his speech. This isn't countered with other testimonies. This is the general image that is drawn by Van Reybrouck. He has been heavily criticized for this, but still, this is the mainstream narrative in Belgium. It was a best-selling novel. Criticism only came from marginal figures back in 2010. There are, though, counter-narratives. For instance, this book by Bambi Kuipens, who is not a literary narrative, but more historical narrative, like much more unambiguous historical narrative in comparison to Van der Heybroek. She has countered what Van der Heybroek said even before he put it in text. So she said, according to many Belgians, evil always came from the outside. They attributed it to individual, malicious, often urban troublemakers who stirred up peaceful, backward, often rural groups. In reality, rural residents were often much more radical than urban political leaders, including Lumumba. So Kuipens is really addressing this colonial imagination that still lives on today from the Belgians. Kuipens, by the way, she's now the director of the Africa Museum in Tervuren. So she speaks from her own position and perspective. She didn't have at the time, but still. So this is, and now here she really analyzes the situation herself. She also leans on what she has observed as an anthropologue in the Congo itself. So she says, for instance, notwithstanding differences in the Congolese image of Lumumba, followers of Moise Tshombe, that's the Katangan leader in Katanga, certainly do not have a positive image of him. The popular comparisons with Moses and Christ stand out. Congolese interpret the Christianity the Belgians have introduced, and well, the Portuguese also have introduced, against the Belgians, and compare them to the enemies of the Jews. So that would be the Egyptians, if Lumumba is identified with Moses, and Romans, if Lumumba is identified with Jesus. So, like Moses, Lumumba was the man who led his people to a new promised country, but wasn't alive to see it. And well, Jesus died for the sins of others to save his people. So in the Congolese imagination, sometimes Lumumba is equal to those two religious figures. This is an example. Here you see like Lumumba being a bit Christ-like. So the interesting thing, if you compare the two, is that there's not this very nuanced image. They choose between one or the other. So for both Kuipens and Van der Heybroek mostly focus on the political life and on the living historical figure and then his historical death. But for Van der Heybroek, he's a leader who was responsible, a writer who wasn't like looking for peace and very undiplomatic. For Kuipens, he was more of a martyr, a prophet who was really important for Congolese culture, and a victim. This historian, Idris Balfouderis, has said that the fact that Van der Heybroek attracts most of attention is an unhealthy situation, typical of the small nation that Belgium or Flanders is. However, it may be that an avant-garde is blazing new trails. So he already saw in 2015 that things were happening, and as an example, I can give this very recent theater play who goes beyond like the representations Kuipens and Van der Heybroek gave. It focuses not on the historical Lumumba, but and it doesn't want to mourn in their analysis his death in 1961, but the play mourns the ongoing death of his ideals for Congo and the black community. But as I'm here, I cannot really analyze the play, so I'm just like giving you this small snippet of this new tendency that, according to many people, is arising and becoming more mainstream in Belgium. So yeah, this is my bibliography. I'm open to all questions. I also wanted to say that, of course, I don't have the same experiences with racism as people of color have, so I'm also open to comments on that. But thank you very much for listening.